It is now my pleasure to introduce today's distinguished guest, Simon Winchester, journalist and author, whose latest book is The Perfectionists: How Precision Engineers Created the Modern World. Simon Winchester truly is a raconteur whose storytelling ability is only equaled by his broad range of interests. Born in London, he has been awarded an OBE, order, is that Order of the British Empire?
Yes, although people say it means other buggers' efforts.
By none other than Queen Elizabeth, and studied geology at Oxford, but does not claim to be a trained geologist.
That was pretty useless. Yeah.
His passions include letterpress printing, beekeeping, astronomy, stamp collecting, model railways, and cider making. Upon graduation from Oxford, Simon initially worked as a field geologist in Uganda. He then soon made a sudden and unexpected switch to journalism, eventually writing for The Guardian as North Ireland correspondent and being named Britain's Journalist of the Year. He also became a frequent commentator on BBC Radio, and in the early 70s he was posted to Washington, D.C. as The Guardian's U.S. correspondent and covered the Watergate affair, the resignation of President Nixon, and the election of Jimmy Carter. After a brief stint as American bureau chief for the Daily Mail, he became chief foreign feature writer for the Sunday London Times. He achieved unintended notoriety during the spring of 1982 when he managed both to be on the Falkland Islands when they were invaded by Argentine forces, and shortly afterwards to be captured in southern Patagonia and held in prison in Argentina for the following 3 months. Simon soon decided to become, I don't know if this was cause and effect, but we can get into that later.
Yes, sure.
Soon decided to become a freelance writer, spending time in such places as Moscow, Hong Kong, and southern China. Fortunately for us, he eventually turned to writing books, including his first huge bestseller, The Professor and the Madman, which I'm assuming a lot of people have read. In his new book, The Perfectionists, Simon discusses the impact of landmark inventions and the minds and methods that have changed the modern world. So please welcome Simon Winchester. Well, I am so honored to be doing this interview with you.
I'm a bit worried because you're the obituaries writer.
Well, I have to say one of the things I do at the New York Times is write advance obituaries. Yeah, right. So maybe afterwards we could have a
chat.
Yeah.
Yes.
But one of the things that I'm so fascinated about your biography, in fact, let's just get started now with this interview for your advance obit. You had a mentor who I find very fascinating in hearing interviews that have been done with you, Jan Morris. Can you tell me a little bit about Jan?
Well, I'll tell you very briefly what happened. I was living in Uganda and on the Congo border and on the Ruwenzori Mountains, and I was quite a keen climber in those days, and I would get as many books as I could on climbing, and one of them that I got from the British Council library nearby was called Coronation Everest by James Morris. And I read this, and it literally the Pauline conversion. I read it and I said, I'm a pretty useless geologist, but I think I much prefer to wander around the world with a notebook and a pencil and write stories about people, and this is what James did. So I wrote to him and said, I'm a 21-year-old geologist in East Africa.
What year was this?
1966. Can I be you? And he wrote back, and I thought he would completely disregard the letter, but he didn't. He wrote a courteous letter back saying, if you really think you can write, then it is the most wonderful way to make a living. You won't make a particularly grand living, but it'll be an interesting one. So my advice to you, on the day you receive this letter, not next week, not next month, but the day you receive it, leave your job in Uganda, come back to Britain, get a job on a local newspaper, and write to me again. And I did exactly that. And it took a long time to get a job because no one wanted a 21-year-old geologist on the staff of a newspaper. So it took 6 or so months to get a job, but eventually I did, by which time I'd read all of James's books about Venice, about Oxford, about Spain, and realised I was dealing with a heavy hitter as a writer. So I wrote him again saying, okay, I've done exactly as you said, I'm now a reporter on a newspaper. And you could sense in his reply the sort of gulp of, you did this? This wasn't exactly what I'd imagined. But now you have. I'll give you 3 further pieces of advice. Number 1, never lose your sense of wonder, because every day you're going to wait to meet extraordinary people and in remarkable places. Don't become sort of world-weary and jaded. Don't bother to learn shorthand. Everyone will tell you have to have 120 words per minute. Pitman, ignore them. And number 3, every few weeks, package up all the clippings of the little stories you're writing, send them to me. Here's my address in North Wales, and I'll annotate them for you and try and turn you into a halfway decent writer. Well, to cut a very long story short, this relationship went on for years, as I was in Newcastle for 2 years, then Belfast for 3, Washington for 4.
But he actually was editing was annotating your...
Yeah, totally.
Just for the record, that is a very generous thing.
It was, believe you me, and I appreciate it to this day. Well, I mean, it literally changed my life, both personal and professional. So, the 9th of August, we never met until the 9th of August, 74, Richard Nixon resigned. The 8th of September, Ford pardoned him, and stupidly that day I was not in Washington, but was covering, if you remember it, Evel Knievel attempting to jump over the Snake River Canyon in Idaho. But then I decided, with Washington falling quiet, I'd go on holiday, I'd go to Britain, I'd go climbing, I'd go to North Wales, which is where James Morris lived. And I went with an Australian climber friend of mine, and we were motoring up, and she said, doesn't your friend James Morris live here? And I said, yes, but I've never met him. She said, well, this is ridiculous, because he's created the monster you've turned into. So the moment we get to the hotel, let's ring him up. And so we did. He was terribly excited and said, come for tea tomorrow. So we went, Jackie and I went climbing and came down from the hills and turned up at this beautiful country house in a little village called Llanystumdwy and rang the doorbell, and I could see through the glass panels on either side, sort of parquet flooring and oriental carpets, and we were filthy dirty having been up on the hills. And so I knelt down, rang the doorbell, and to remove our climbing boots, and the door opened and a woman appeared, and I said, oh, hello, I'm Simon Winchester, this is Jackie Leishman, you must be Mrs. Morris. And this person said, no, I'm James, actually. And there was this strange moment, but back in the 70s people wore their hair rather long, and so I stood up and I said, I'm so sorry, you never can tell these days. And then this person said, I'll get my wife, and I thought, well, this is, you know, the Welsh are peculiar people, maybe this is some kind of joke. And because James had climbed Mount Everest to 26,000 feet, had fathered 4 children, was a soldier in the Brigade of Guards in the British Army, had walked alone across the Hadramawt. So he was very much a man's man, so whoever was going to come down the stairs was clearly going to be in a beard and a Yukon Jack shirt or something. Not at all. Woman, middle-aged lady, a little girl in tow. We all go into the drawing room for tea, with me, fairly obviously a man, and Jackie, obviously a young woman. Elizabeth Morris, middle-aged lady. You have to excuse this cold.
Feel free to take a drink.
Thank you so much for water, yes. And their little girl. And then my hero, James, twin set and pearls, little tweed skirt, little handkerchief chucked in her sleeve, court shoes, and all the rather substantial accoutrements of womanhood. Being written, nothing was said about this. We just sat and drank our tea.
So the Brits are, yeah.
Yeah, and so tea was over, and as we drove away, Jackie said, what was all that about? I have no idea. And we went back in the hotel the next morning. A note was pushed under the door saying, dear Simon, I'm sorry to have put you through a somewhat awkward social occasion, but the fact of the matter is that I'm turning into a woman, and I'm going to Casablanca next week and to have the necessary surgery, and I hope you can accept it, and I hope we'll be the best of friends. So we've written books together. She's now 91. She's back with Elizabeth, and for years afterwards, The Guardian would say, anyone who wants to be a reporter on The Guardian, has to do two things: get a bad degree in geology from Oxford, and then make friends with a transsexual. Anyway, end of story. I'll recover while you're asking the question.
Well, that's a wonderful story of how we then became the beneficiaries of what you now do. And one thing I wanted to ask you was, and as a fellow writer of nonfiction narratives, it's always fascinating to me how people get their ideas. And by the way, I have to say that I don't, Simon's bibliography is very, very, very long. I don't know if you rival Joyce Carol Oates yet, but but I fear that if I stepped outside for an hour, you'd have another book. So, Professor, let's start with Professor and the Madman, since that's a book that so many of us know and love so dearly. And oh, thank you. We just got some
Golly.
tea with a honey bear to go.
Oh, honey bear, that's great. Thank you.
So this is, in case people don't know the story of how this, how you got the idea to do Professor and the Madman. Why don't you tell it briefly?
Well, I was doing a book for Henry Holt, the publishers, on I was buying a tramp steamer that was laid up in the Baltic to write a book about the joys of any form of maritime transportation which didn't involve container ships, which I think are a horrible thing to behold. And I was well on into the writing, or at least not the writing, but I had found the ship that I wanted and negotiated a decent price, and I found the crew and so forth. And then my editor came in, invited me to lunch one day, so we went to a restaurant in New York, and then back to her office, and what often happens is that the editor rather proudly displays all the books she's publishing that autumn, and said, take any one you want. And I took a copy almost at random of a book by a man called Jonathan Green called Chasing the Sun, Dictionaries and the Men Who Made Them. And I took it up to I did this because when I lived in Hong Kong, I bought inexpensively a complete, then 13-volume OED, and I treasured it. I loved dictionaries. So this seemed a good fit. So I had a little house up in upstate New York, and I was reading it the following morning in the bath. And as I said, then, such a pretentious thing to do, reading a book about lexicography in the bath. No, I know, but just to forestall you. And there was this line said, readers of this book, rather specialist book, will of course know the story of Dr. W.C. Minor, the deranged American lunatic murderer, who was such a prolific contributor to the OED. And I sat up in the bath sort of like Archimedes. Never heard of this. This is amazing. I wonder if there's a book about it. And by great good fortune, one of those moments that you just, all the stars aligned.
And you remember where you were.
I remember vividly being in the bath. The phone was on the floor beside me, and I picked it up, and by equal good fortune, I remembered the number of the only lexicographer in the world I knew, who was a woman in Oxford. I remembered her number, 011441865556767. I remember it to this day, Elizabeth Knowles, and it was 7:15 when I was in the bath, and therefore 12:15 in Oxford, and she didn't answer and didn't answer and didn't answer, and then I was just about to hang up when there was a rather grumpy hello, and I said, Elizabeth, it's Simon, I'm so sorry if you hear any strange noises, splashing, sort of, I'm in the bath in America, but I simply want to ask you, do you know anything about a chap called W.C. Minor? And she said, you're in luck. I probably know more about W.C. Minor than anyone in the world, because I wrote a paper 20 years ago assessing his contributions to the OED, which was published in a journal of lexicography called Dictionaries, published in Madison, Wisconsin. And if you care to get out of your bath and towel yourself dry and stand by the fax machine, which we had in those days, I'll send you the article. And she did, and then she rang. The last sheet came through just to make sure I had received it. And all I cared about was the bibliography. Was there a book? Mm-hmm. And she said, oh, by the way, have you received it? And I said, yes. And she said, I remember going to Broadmoor, the lunatic asylum where he was imprisoned, and saw his medical file, 11 or 12 linear feet of documents, which I wasn't allowed to see, but she said, I warrant the law has changed. And if you can get in to see them, there's rather a good story. And that's what happened.
Wow, talk about everything coming
It
together
really did.
at the right time, at the right place, in the right bathtub.
Yeah.
And it's finally, after many years, going to be made into a film, or is being made into a film right now.
As we speak, with Mel Gibson playing the professor, James Murray, and with Sean Penn playing the lunatic, with Jennifer Ely, who some of you may remember as playing Elizabeth Bennet in the BBC series of Pride and Prejudice, and a woman called Natalie Dormer, who I'd not heard of before, but she's in Game of Thrones, mostly naked, I gather, in Game of Thrones. There would not be a great deal of nakedness in 19th century dictionary making. And it's at the moment, I mean, they've done 41 days of filming in Dublin, which my wife and I went over to see. And it's on track, I think, to be finished later this year. There's been a sort of legal problem, but that's Hollywood. And we ought to see it sometime for Christmas, I would hope.
And who did the screenplay?
Screenplay, there were many. The film was
As
bought
usual.
initially by Luc Besson, the French director, and then it was bought from him by Mel Gibson, who owns it now. And there were many screenplays, but the chap who actually finished it and is now directing it is a marvellous man called Farhad Safinia, who is a Cambridge-educated Iranian, but he sounds totally British. And he's done a wonderful job. When I went over there, the instruction to me was, be there on set to advise and all the rest of it, but don't interfere. In other words, it's our film. But they did it beautifully. And there's a contentious scene when the madman is visited by the widow of the man he has killed. And I'm not going to tell you what actually happens in the cell, but it's perfectly tasteful.
And I did hear an interview with you once where you had a role in the film as the victim.
I was wanting to, I wanted to be, yes, the dead man, exactly.
Yeah.
So I wanted to be sort of carried off, as perhaps, maybe hear me coughing is what should happen to me now. No, I think they nixed that idea.
Oh.
No, but they said they've got 3 more days of filming to do in Oxford. And they've promised me that once they get to Oxford, they'll call me and I'll put on my cap and gown. And, because I'm still a fellow, for the rest of my life, I think I'll be a fellow of my college. So I have my gown, which is hanging up on a hook outside the hall in my old college. And I'll retrieve it in my mortarboard and I'll be seen scurrying, looking academic. I dare say with facial hair to play a Don. So that I'll be happy.
Well, let's turn to the newest book,
Right.
The Perfectionists, while we're on the subject of how you get your ideas, I love your description of how many people, by the way, have read it already. Not yet. It's just out.
Yes, I was going to say it's a bit early days for anyone
Yeah,
to have read
it's
it.
really just wonderful and got a really glowing review in the New York Times. So the reviewer really seemed to get it.
Really did. It was a lady in London, and yes, she's an engineer, and it was one of those incredible reviews.
We say that when we get good reviews. They really got it. And when we get bad reviews,
Yeah, but
didn't get
occasionally
it.
they don't. And we really hate the reviewer for the rest of our days.
So tell us about the genesis of this book.
Well, I don't remember what I was planning to write. I had written this book on the Pacific Ocean. Now, I think this was actually earlier than that. I'd written a book about the Atlantic Ocean and was planning a book about America, which I had just become a citizen of. So that must have been 2011.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here, really am. And I should say parenthetically what the judge said to me. I took the oath on the after deck of the USS Constitution. This wonderful, it's in Boston Harbor. It was very moving on July the 4th, 2011. And the thing which even now to this day brings a sort of tear to my eye was that she said, those of us here on the dais are Americans. We were born. But you 20 standing in front of me today, you chose to be Americans.
A lesson for our
Very,
times.
exactly, very moving. So I did. I mean, I love this country. I've not given up my British citizenship, but I believe in this country and everything it stands for. Anyway, moving right along. So at about the same time as all that happened, I got a letter out of the blue from a chap in Florida called Colin Povey. And he said, I've read all your books, and I like them very much, and I wonder whether you'd be interested in trying to write a book on the history of precision, which is everywhere, all about us, central to our modern existence, but it has a known beginning. We don't know where it's going to lead us. But I just think he said, you'd be the right chap to do it. He said, I'm not a precision engineer myself. He was or remains, a scientific glass blower. So he makes little intricate things for use in laboratories around the United States. But I thought this was actually a terribly good idea. It was my father was a precision engineer. He made tiny electric motors for the guidance systems of torpedoes, and would often bring things back from the factory to amaze me. And also, I had this bizarre relationship which derived from a story I was asked to do in 1984 when I was living in London. What had happened was, this was in the days when commissioning editors spent money like drunken sailors, and it doesn't happen anymore, but I was given this wonderful assignment. The English, said this editor, know nothing about Europe and want to know even less. So why don't you go to Europe, make 6 journeys around Europe with a photographer, and write, by any means of transportation you like, and write 6 long essays with photographs. So I said, absolutely wonderful. So I got a yacht and sailed it from Stockholm to Helsinki. I got 2 motorbikes and we rode them from Munich to Turin. I got 2 horses and rode them through the Black Forest of southwest Germany. Walked from Cadiz, at least I walked, the lazy photographer drove, from Cadiz to Gibraltar. I took a train from the Victoria Station in London to the Victoria Hotel in Brieg in Switzerland. And then we had to decide to drive a car from the westernmost point of Europe to the easternmost. And we decided, sort of slightly cheated, that the westernmost point would be the end of Finistère in northern France, and the easternmost would be the city of Astrakhan in the Soviet Union, as it was then, because this was 1984, where the Volga enters the Caspian Sea. And we were having lunch in the Travellers Club in Pall Mall, and obviously drank too much, I think. It was a summer's afternoon. And Patrick, the photographer, said, do we really have to go in your crummy old Volvo station wagon? And I said, no, probably not. Why don't we take a Rolls Royce? And he said, go downstairs. And so, emboldened by drink, I went down to the phone booth and called Rolls Royce and said, the name's Winchester, I'm doing this. And they said, we'll call you back in half an hour. And half an hour later, he rang back and he said, well, you're in luck because we have an Ocean Blue Silver Spirit coming off the production line tomorrow, a cancelled order. And if you'd like to pick it up, you can have it for the next 3 months, drive it wherever you like. So it was wonderful. I was given a tour of how they make Rolls Royces and had this massive 4-ton monster. The only embarrassing thing was its registration plate, which was RRM1 for Rolls Royce Motors 1. But it proved handy actually, because every time I parked it outside the Sunday Times building on Gray's Inn Road, the parking meter people thought it was Rupert Murdoch. And I lived in a little village in Oxfordshire, and whenever I drove the car to the house, all the villagers would come up because they thought that Roger Moore. So right from the start, I knew Rolls Royces were going to be a valuable journalistic tool, as indeed it proved. And so the picture that was used from that particular trip to illustrate all 6 of the pieces was of me outside the great gate of Kiev in the Ukraine, in front of an agitprop picture of Lenin pointing to the joys of a socialist future, with me sitting on the hood of this magnificent beast pointing into the very evident joys of a capitalist future. So the result of this was that for a good 15 years after, wherever I was and that Rolls-Royce Limited knew I was there, they'd loan me a car. And the next story was over here, it was in Southern California. I was doing a piece with another photographer called Don McCullin on the gangs of East Los Angeles, because they were threatening to disrupt the 1984 Olympic Games. And checked into the Ambassador Hotel on Wilshire Boulevard, and there was a little envelope. The concierge gave me this envelope, and it was the keys to a Rolls-Royce Camargue, probably the ugliest Rolls-Royce ever built. But they gave it, I could have it for the entire duration. And you would have thought it would have not been useful when approaching the gangs of East Los Angeles, but in fact, it proved once again a useful tool, because the principal gang we wanted to see was called the White Fences, run by a really unpleasant desperado, who melted when we turned up in this car and said, "I will allow you to take my photograph and give an interview if I can drive your car." And the cover picture was of him driving the car with a huge cigar in his mouth and a gigantic machine gun in his right hand. So it sort of said everything.
And the Rolls-Royce plays a role in this.
Well, it does indeed, yeah, because in one of the Rollses, it was a Seraph, I think a silver Seraph, that they loaned me to make a journey with another photographer from Land's End to John O'Groats in Cornwall to the north of Scotland. I got in, I went up to the factory and was putting my bag in the, what we in England call the boot.
The trunk.
I'm so sorry. And I nicked my hand on it. It was, I cut this finger, I think it was, and I thought, this is very odd. Kind of, in a Rolls-Royce, everything about it is smooth and finished. But I looked very carefully and there was a tiny screw which was misaligned, and so the edge of it was proud of the surface. And as if that wasn't, well, that was horrifying to me, it showed the slipping in standards and all the rest of it. But there was a review in the papers a few weeks later where, of the same model, a Rolls-Royce Silver Seraph, and the chap had put on the parking brake and it came off in his hand. There was a long wire attached to it. And shortly thereafter, Rolls-Royce Motors was sold, and now it belongs to the Germans.
So this question of precision, I have to say, I looked up, you know, it's precision everything these days, right? It's a big marketing part of can be a big part of marketing campaigns. And so I went and did a quick Google search on precision. So we have, of course, precision medicine and precision aircraft and precision filters and precision tires, Firestone. And then I found a precision moving company in Somerville, Massachusetts.
They'll get the right address.
Yes. A super precision credit union somewhere. And then my favorite was Precision Hydration, the sweat experts, electrolyte supplements that match how you sweat.
I'm afraid this escaped my book.
But this is a good time to step back and explain for us the difference between precision and accuracy.
Yes, the two, I tend to use them as we in customary, colloquial English do more or less interchangeably, and yet to an engineer they're not interchangeable. They mean two very different things. And the easiest way to illustrate the difference is to think of a target that you're firing arrows or bullets into. Your intention is to get those arrows or bullets in the center, in the bull. And if you hit the bull, then that is a display of great accuracy. Accuracy is how close to your intention is your action, or the result of your action. Whereas precision is if you fire the same bow and arrow or the same bullet, and it hits maybe not necessarily the bull, maybe at 10 o'clock or so, in an outer ring, but it hits the same place time after time after time after time, then that is great precision. It's obviously ideal if you can combine precision and accuracy, but it's important in mechanical engineering because making the same thing to the same dimensions over and over and over again underlies the principle of the making of interchangeable parts. And interchangeable parts is the key to manufacturing. So when Henry Ford made his Model T Ford, every part out of which that was assembled was exactly the same, to the tenths of a millimetre.
So speaking of interchangeable parts, I have to say that Eli Whitney is in this book, and I am one of those who in third grade got to know Eli Whitney as the inventor of the cotton gin, and he's always just been, he's synonymous with that, right? Simon, here comes this British American, to actually set us straight on that, and it turns out he was a fraud. And but the interchangeable parts story is really interesting, and that was a scoop. Was that a scoop on your part?
No, I didn't think so. It's buried deep in the sort of engineering literature, but I've had a lot of letters from engineers saying at last someone has uncovered this charlatan. What happened was that the true principle of interchangeable parts, although it had been originated in May 1776 by an English engineer called John Wilkinson, it really took momentum in France, and there was an engineer there called Honoré Blanc who broke apart the flintlock of a flintlock musket, which has about 10 parts. There's the trigger, there's the lever, there are things called the frizzle and the pan and the spring. And he decided that up to that point, muskets were made by hand, and if you broke your trigger, you had to have a completely new gun made. But he said, let us make every single component part exactly the same, in other words, very precisely. And he put out a box with 100 frizzle springs and 100 pans and 100 levers and 100 triggers, and invited the great and the good of Paris in 1889, I think, to witness a demonstration of how you could pick any piece from any box, and fitting together they would make a gun. One of the people that was invited was the then American minister to Paris, to France, and that was Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson saw this, and Jefferson, being a brilliant chap, said, this is just going to revolutionize American manufacturing, which at the time obviously was very limited because the Industrial Revolution was only just then getting underway. So he wrote to the Secretary of War in Washington and said, I've seen this most amazing demonstration of how to use this principle of interchangeable parts to make guns. We should apply this principle to the great armories. There were only two in the United States, one in Harpers Ferry and one in Springfield, Massachusetts. Who would like to be the first to win a contract from the US Army to make guns using this principle? And Eli Whitney, who needed the money very badly because he had never patented the cotton gin, said, me. And so he arranged a demonstration in the early part of the 19th century. And when he did it, and once again the great and the good assembled, and he cheated. He had already made up lots of flintlocks, and the only interchangeability of them was to make sure that the hole in several stocks, the wooden part of a gun, was the same, so that the whole assembly simply fit into the stocks. It was a ludicrous demonstration, which was in no way a demonstration of the interchangeability of the parts that went to make up the flintlock. But it sufficiently impressed the people who were, artless and not particularly skilled, and they said, that's very impressive, we'll place an order. And so they placed an order for, I think, 8,000 of these guns, relieving Mr. Whitney of his financial problems. And he was late, he was 6 or 7 or 8 years late, and none of the guns worked properly. So within the engineering community, he is widely regarded as a fraud, a charlatan, a greedy cheat. And I know I'm going to be very unpopular in schools all over America for a while, but then I became unpopular by saying it was not Christopher Columbus who first discovered North America, it was Eric the Viking, and 491 years before, and we shouldn't be celebrating Columbus Day, we should...
We don't, and don't worry.
Right, exactly. So, right. But anyway, so unpopularity is not a problem for me.
And in the book, what I love so much about this book is that it all seems to flow. It spans a couple of centuries.
Yeah.
And it flows beautifully from one precisely engineered thing to all the way up through transistors. And it's such a joy to read because a lot of it is very complex. And so, Simon, I have to say, are you Sir Simon or?
No, good Lord, no BE.
No,
He's very much a junior.
Okay, junior.
Junior rank.
Junior,
yeah.
Sir. Sir Junior.
Yeah.
So it's really hard. You have to master the complexity of, say, what would you say one of the most complex things you were trying to explain in this book was? Because then you not only master it, but you then explain it to us in such a in a way that we can understand?
Well, I think,
What's a good example?
well, I think a good example is, and also a good example of working with a very good editor, a woman called Sarah Nelson in New York. What I'd done was I'd taken the narrative arc of the book is the increasing tininess of the tolerances of the things that were being made. So that the first cylinder made for James Watt accommodated the piston such that between the piston and the wall of the cylinder you could fit an English shilling, which was 0.1 of an inch thick. So I thought, well, that'll give me the narrative arc, because if the first chapter is about things that are 0.1 of an inch, then the next chapter could be 0.001, and the next chapter 0.00001, right up to the most precise thing that human agency has made thus far is also, as it happens, a cylinder. It's a cylinder of fused silica. There are 4 of them, 2 in Washington State and 2 in Louisiana, which are at the beating heart of these observatories called LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatories. And the cylinder there is machined or ground or polished to an accuracy of 1/10,000th of the diameter of a proton, which, if you put it into numbers, a proton's diameter is 1 femtometer, so 10 to the minus 15. And 10,000ths of that adds another 4 zeros. So that's 10 to the minus 19. So in other words, 0.1 to 0.0019 zeros 1 is the sort of range of this book. So in the narrative, I get to, let's say, 1/1,000,000th of an inch, and 1 times 10 to the minus 7. And then I thought, let's pause and talk about, as a sort of entr'acte, metrology and the science of measurement. And the editor, quite wisely in my view, said, after reading it, that really interrupts the narrative. So just let's proceed, let's take that out and put it into an afterword, which is what I've done. But the thing about the afterword, and I think this gets to your point of explaining complex things in a relatively accessible manner, I became fascinated with the fact that this year, 2018, November this year, sees the end of the last object, the last physical object in the world against which we will measure things. I mean, all human history, we have measured things against, first of all, the human body. The oldest measurement in the world is the cubit from the Babylonians, and that was the length of a pharaoh's forearm, that is 1 cubit. And if you read your Bible, that's how you should measure things, Noah's Ark and so forth. Then, people like the Saxons and indeed the Romans, I think the thumb is an inch, and the foot is a foot, and 1,000 paces, 1000 passus, is 1 mile. And then the French got involved, and the French being the French, they came up with a somewhat more romantic, less romantic, but nonetheless sort of reasonable thing, which was that they drew a line through Paris, of course, from the pole to the equator, measured its length, divided it by 10 million, and said that's the metre. And they cast that length in a piece of platinum, and that was the metre. Well, there was a speech in 1870 by a Scottish physicist called James Clerk Maxwell, who said none of these things are stable enough to be used as the basis for measurement, because our thumbs are all different sizes and our feet are different sizes. And the world, that's not precise, it shrinks and revolves at changing rates, and gravity, all non-stable. So the only thing which is really stable is the radiation from atoms and molecules. So everything's got to be measured according to numbers related to frequency and radiation and wavelength. And so slowly all of these things were abandoned, and the very last thing to be abandoned exists in Paris at the moment under 3 glass domes in a basement in a Sèvres, where Sèvres porcelain comes from, is a cylinder of platinum. It's called the IPK, the International Prototype Kilogram, and that is the kilogram. So whenever you buy, let's say, a kilogram of sugar, well, if you bring Canada, because of course the only countries in the world which do not fully accept the metric system are Liberia, in Myanmar and the United States of America. Just astonishes me. But all the scientists here do. So whenever you, let's stick to the kilogram of sugar, you buy a kilogram of sugar, the scale that tests that is ultimately in California tested against. In Sacramento there is a standard kilogram, and every so often that's taken to Washington to be measured in Gaithersburg, Maryland, against the standard kilogram there. Once every year that is taken in a secure briefcase over to Paris to be measured against 6 what are called witness kilograms, or témoins, and every so often, only 4 times since the 1890s, have the 3 cloches been taken off the master kilogram, the Grand K, and the witness kilograms measured against that. Well, this year it has been decreed by the BIPM, the Bureau International des Plaques et des Mesures, that the physical kilogram will cease to be, and it'll be consigned to a museum, and in its place the unit of mass will be composed of a calculation based on the Planck constant and the speed of light. So it's all be numbers, and this romantic period of measuring things against these beautiful objects of platinum will cease to be, which I regret very much.
Yeah, it gives new meaning to sort of the demise of bricks and mortar.
Yes.
Another virtual guest. So I thought I'd toss in a question from the audience. This is a wonderful question. When it comes to inventions, which is your favorite of all time and why?
Golly, to look at, well, there was a wonderful, 2 wonderful people in Britain, Roland Emmett, and I can't remember his first name, but Heath Robinson. And they both made these incredible inventions, imaginary inventions. Like I remember a device which involved water wheels and things, and hot water bottles which were applied to the legs of Scotsmen in kilts to keep their legs warm when fighting in hostile Arctic environments. So if you see anything...
Is that,
these are not serious inventions. So and you have an American, what's his name, who invented... Rube Goldberg. I don't think his were as witty as Heath Robinson. Look up the name Heath Robinson and you'll see some... Because they could work. They're all entirely plausible and they're very, very funny. But in terms of real inventions, well, I suppose I'd have to say that the invention was rather bloodless and perhaps not so interesting, but the one that is most remarkable and has changed our lives so much is this ultimately very simple electronic device, the transistor, which was invented in 1948 in Bell Labs, and about the size of your hand, the first one. You can go to the museum there and see it. And nowadays, if you take an average cell phone, Apple iPhone 8, that has a chip in it which is about the size of my pinky finger nail. It's called an A11. It's made in Taiwan. And it has 4.3 billion transistors in it. Not million, but billion. These are things which were only invented 60, 70 years ago. And there are now, it is reliably said by Intel, that there are now...
Usually reliable source.
A usually reliable source and totally unbiased in these matters. There are more transistors in the world today than there are leaves on all the trees in all the world today. And that is an extraordinary figure. And they're making them at the rate of 13 trillion transistors a day. And our life would not be the same without this. So although it's a bloodless, unromantic, and I love steam trains, they couldn't be more different. But in terms of realizing the importance, I think transistors have it.
And that segues into another question from the audience. What's your best advice for budding inventors? And budding writers, by the way, but we'll get to that.
Well, budding writers write to me and I'll be as kind as James was to me, but I'm not planning on changing my gender. Well, I think advice to budding inventors, one of the, to me, important messages, which I try and get across in a sort of increasing way in the chapters in this book, is let's keep our feet on the ground. Let's not become too obsessed with precision. Let's not worship it, let's not fetishize it, let's not it sort of cloud our judgment in relation to other things, and the other things, by that I largely mean craftsmanship. And I think there is a danger that some countries might be so overwhelmed by or wedded to precision that we do lose sight of some of the elemental and imprecise ways of doing things. So I went, in writing this book, my wife is ethnically Japanese, and at her urging, because she talks to me about concepts like wabi-sabi, which are the appreciation of the imperfect, beauty in the imprecise, go to Seiko. Seiko are the inventors of the quartz watch movement. So I went to their factory in Morioka, which is in northern Japan, set in a beautiful bamboo forest. And you go to the second floor, and there's a production line there, all run by robots, very noisy, producing out of millions of interchangeable parts, 25,000 wristwatch movements every day. Chatter, 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 and they produce these things. And I think that my handlers thought I looked a little bit disappointed, and they said, well, no, don't worry, we're Japanese, we do things rather differently, so come through this set of doors. And I went through into, still on the second floor, and suddenly everything becomes sort of cathedral quiet. And there's a room, a large room, in which there are 20 men and women, all sitting at desks, all with tweezers and magnifying glasses and very delicate instruments, hand-making mechanical watches still. And the mechanical watches which are produced, and they're called Grand Seikos, they don't sell particularly well. They don't keep time particularly brilliantly. I mean, a quartz watch will give you in digital readout time to 3 places of decimals. One of the Grand Seikos, you have to wind it, and it ticks, and you hear the noise of the mechanism inside and know that a human being constructed it. You'll have to reset it every few days. I take great pleasure in I lived in an old farmhouse in Massachusetts, and I have 8 clocks and a barograph, from which for the last nearly 20 years I've faithfully recorded the rise and fall of atmospheric pressure. All of these are clockwork. So from the moment I get up on every Sunday morning, I wind them all, move their hands back and forward, so that by Sunday breakfast time, they're all in rate, as they say. And you watch during the week as they fall slowly out of rate. By Monday, they're still more or less in rate. By Tuesday, they're falling out of rate. And by Wednesday, they're called wildly wrong. But that brings to mind a lovely line from Dorothy L. Sayers, that marvellous detective book, Gaudy Night, in which she talks about walking through Oxford on a summer midnight and listening to the college clocks chiming midnight in, as she puts it, in friendly disagreement. And I just love that line. It applies to my clocks. And so I would say to any inventor, keep your feet on the ground and revel in craftsmanship and the imprecise, revel in wood and ceramics and iron metalwork and in what's called urushi, lacquerware. And don't necessarily be caught up in the world of ultra precision, because I wonder where it's going to lead to, whereas there'll always be room for craft.
You call it, I think in the book you call it the search for equipoise, is that what?
Yes, I think there should be in society an equipoise between a love on the one hand for titanium and on the other hand a respect for bamboo.
I love that. And then these, when you were telling the Seiko story, I was reminded of, you said that the workers, you have a wonderful picture of their exercise breaks.
Every 15 minutes, I think it is. Or maybe it's
every hour they have to take 10 or 15
minutes for exercise.
And they do stretching, and it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. And then didn't you say that they at one point all got fired and then rehired?
Yes, that was the extraordinary thing, because when Seiko abandoned caught up in the frenzy of digital watchmaking and indeed fetishized precision, which is exactly what I wish people didn't do, and said, oh, the era of mechanical watches is over. They fired everybody and put all their efforts into making digital watches, but then they realized that they had guaranteed the mechanical watches, that there was no one left to repair them if they went wrong, which was infrequent because they were beautifully made, but people would ring up and say, my watch, which I bought in 1948, has gone wrong, and they had to bring out of retirement elderly watchmakers and realised that there still was a sort of nascent demand, and that what these people should do, the elderly ones that were still around, were to pass their skills on to a new generation of watchmakers. And so many of the people, most of the people now are pretty young, making mechanical watches, which brings to mind another thing about Japan and Korea, which I find so wonderful.
And you've
Which-
written a whole book about Korea.
Yeah, that long, jolly nice of you to remember that. Long time ago. Thank you. Is that both Korea and Japan award this government title, living national treasure, to those people, usually quite elderly men and women, who have become brilliant in their lifetime at work in bamboo or lacquerware or ceramics, and are so given a title, honours, a pension, such that their work is lauded by society. And yet we think of Japan, do we not, as a country of Canon and Nikon and Kyocera and so forth, being a highly precise society. And yet what I like about it so much is that it has equipoise in its reverence for craft as well.
That's a wonderful principle to try to live by, especially now. So, do you have, speaking of the many books you've written, do you have a favorite?
Yes, I do. I mean, to be not unduly vulgar about it, I mean, my bank manager's favourite is The Professor and the Madman. But my personal favourite is a book which is, it's still in print, but I think it was pretty obscure and remains so, and that's The River at the Centre of the World.
The
which
Yangtze.
is, the Yangtze.
Mm-hmm.
I so enjoyed that. I took about a year travelling upstream from where the Yangtze debouches into the East China Sea, and went up through the great cities of Nanjing and Wuhan and Chongqing through the Three Gorges, and then it turns sharply northwards and goes through sort of sub-Tibetan China and then rises in a place called Gelandandong, but up in the Tibetan plateau. And I loved writing the book, and I went with an extremely tall, very fierce, very powerful Chinese woman called Yu Ping. And so it was essentially our book, and very sadly she died recently, and so the book is a sort of memorial to her in a way, and I have great affection for it, and I love China.
So it remains your favorite book that you've, that's wonderful.
I think so. It's always slightly embarrassing going back and reading what you wrote.
Really?
Yes, I find it slightly uncomfortable, yeah.
Is writing getting easier for you, or?
No, I think it's getting more difficult because it's a difficult thing to explain, really, but I find as I get older, in a way you look back on your earlier books and are slightly embarrassed by the sort of juvenile nature of them. And equally, you look back on it and say, how on earth did I write a sentence that was so clever? I'm clearly not so clever today. So you have two conflicting. I mean, someone came up to me during this tour, he said that phrase in, and I forget what book, but I had called someone a gasconading lickspittle.
What is?
Well, gasconading is to behave like a Gascon goose, so very proud and haughty, and a lickspittle is a toady. So it's a very insulting thing to say of somebody. And I think I'm not clever enough to say that again now. And I wonder where that cleverness came from, and indeed where it's gone.
Maybe we only have phrases like that sort of once in a lifetime.
Well, I think you're right, yeah.
Yeah. But I think I read an interview with you where you said actually your earlier books were done quickly because you still were approaching things very sort of as a daily journalist.
Yeah, exactly, that's exactly right.
And then you began to take more care and more time. And
But it's. I mean, I loved being. I mean, the Professor and the Madman. I mean, you're going to be horrified to hear this. It took 6 weeks to write.
oh my God.
It was just so easy. It just was an amazing story. The files were all there because I did get access to these 12 feet of his medical files, and the story just wrote itself.
Well, people say that just wrote itself, but
Well, no, it did. It really did. But today I would be much in the same way that had W.C. Minor been given the appropriate drugs to deal with his schizophrenia in prison, that would have made him a different person, and he probably wouldn't have did all the work on the dictionary, which made him the person he was. Similarly, today, because I think about the writing in a different way, and I'm sort of more meticulous and measured and less journalistic, I probably couldn't write The Professor in the Madman today, so it was appropriate, for me anyway, to its time. So, but on the other hand, I find this adventure, if you like, completely fascinating as a writer, to see, it's going to sound rather pretentious and I don't mean to, but you see oneself evolve as a writer in what you're doing, and knowing that what you're writing today is very different in tone and style from what it was 20 years ago is fascinating.
So may I ask what's next? This one is just fresh out of the oven, but
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of a number of things. I want to do a book on land, on the history of land, as it were, because I was a sort of a geologist, but mainly starting with the Oklahoma land runs of 1889. I find that a fascinating concept. People need land so much, not just in this country, but all over the world. So humankind's love for land. But actually the story, the immediate story that I'm particularly interested in, is involves a San Francisco lawyer called Wayne Collins, who...
is that name familiar to?
Does anyone know who Wayne Collins is? Well, I'm glad, because I liked it to be an obscure chap. Well, he was a very angry man. He was an Irishman, and with all that comes with being an angry Irishman. I think the occasional drink was involved. And but he started the ACLU here in San Francisco, and he was very much involved, as my wife is, and this really comes from my wife's side of the family, with the internment of the Japanese Americans during the Second World War in these 10 concentration camps which were dotted around the country. And he had clients in the closest one to here, which is Tule Lake on the Oregon border. And he went up there once in late 1945, with the war still going on, but clearly coming to its end. And as he was leaving after some routine business, one of the guards said to him, "You do know, Mr. Collins, don't you, that nearly 6,000 of the people here, who were American citizens, they were born in this country, are so angry with the way they've been treated by the American government that they have formally renounced their citizenship. So they have abandoned America. And the American government is going to deport them. Once the war is over, it's going to say, right, you're aliens, you're not Americans, we're going to throw you out. To where, we don't know, because they are not citizens of anywhere else. And Collins was outraged and went and talked to their leadership, and they said, yes, there are plans to put us on ships. Liberty ships have been chartered in San Francisco Bay, put them all on, and we're going to take them probably to Japan, but anywhere basically outside the United States. And does that mean we should stop talking?
No, you're good to go.
Oh, I'm good to go, sorry. I thought that's musical interlude or something. So the war comes to an end. Hundreds of these people are brought to San Francisco to be put on boats, to be sent somewhere else. But during that period, the leaders of the movement said, now hang on a moment, we're angry at America and everyone must understand why we're angry at America, but actually deciding to cease to be citizens is very short-sighted. We want our citizenship back. And the American government said, sorry, you've lost it, that's it, you're done, you're aliens, go away. And Collins was outraged by this. He said, you should sympathize with their attitude. Of course they are. They're born here. Of course they're Americans. You should not deport them. Well, the government was in no mood to listen to anything like this, loaded them on the ships. Collins got a habeas corpus writ and managed, as the ships were weighing, untying the ropes, to get them brought off. So they're now in San Francisco, and while their case is attempting to get their citizenship back are adjudicated, they're free to go. But the government says to Collins, okay, well, he said to the government, the Department of the Interior, I would like to file a class action suit on behalf of all of them to get, and they said, no, you've got to fight every single case on its merits. 5,869 cases. And so he did. And it took him till 1974. And every single one he succeeded. He was paid in tomatoes and carrots, because these people had nothing. I mean, everything had been taken away from them by the government for no reason other than that they were Japanese. And so finally, the last one in 1974 was granted, it was a woman, I think, her citizenship back. And he said, I'm not going on holiday. And he got on a plane bound for Hawaii, and as they were coming down to Honolulu Airport, the stewardesses asked everyone to bring their seat back to the full upright and locked position, and he didn't, and he was discovered to be dead. So the story has a tremendous sort of, it's important, it's socially important, it's a part of American history which is overlooked generally, less in California than the East Coast, where no one knows anything about it on the East Coast. And my wife is deeply involved because she has this remarkable project. She's a former NPR journalist, but also a ceramicist. And she's created, there were 120,000 Japanese put in these camps. And so she made 120 yellow ceramic tea bowls as a sort of symbol of humanity and oneness and good stuff. And we went on a massively long journey to all of the camps and photographed these tea bowls in situ. There are 2 in Arkansas, there's 2 in California, 2 in Arizona, and then 1 each in Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, and Colorado. We went to them all. Very few people have been to them all. They're beastly, beastly places, and anyone that was incarcerated in them, and of course there are quite a few survivors left today, thinks this is a story which deserves to be told.
Well, what I love so much about it is the conceit is that you're describing this entire world using this one grain of sand, which is Collins.
Yeah.
So you're using him as your way to tell a much bigger story, which is.
So this is sort of what happened with the Professor in the Mad, telling the story of lexicography through poor old W.C. Minor, and geology through William Smith, and China through Joseph Needham. So yes, one could say it's my way of doing these things, but we'll see if it works.
Well, sadly, we only have time for one more question, and I'll put in another question from the audience, which is, this one is close to my heart as well. As a grandparent of 2 small kids, how do we help them navigate the proliferation of screens and tech?
Golly.
Golly is right.
I don't know, maybe this is just weariness. I mean, every day on this tour, I have reveled in the fact that I have found a paper copy of the New York Times. I've been sitting there reading it and reveling in paper and getting ink on my fingers and finding out that everything I want to know is in this paper. Whereas if I look at the website, it's you don't feel this sense of fullness, if you like, that you're limited by what's on the front page and a few subsidiary pages. So, and I live on this farm and I make elemental things like honey and apples.
Fix your clocks.
Fix my clock. I mean, I'm just going back in time. I'm just I'm reversing my life. So, of course, I am not Luddite enough to disregard technology, but I don't know. I look at Filmstruck, which is a great app, but all the films I look at on it were made in like 1940 and 1935 and so forth. So I'm getting very nostalgic in old age.
You really are. Well,
that's pathetic, isn't it?
No, I think it's lovely. It's your own form of equipoise, perhaps.
Exactly.
Well,
I'm not overwhelmed by precision.
No, you are not, even though I have to say this obsession with the clocks. You do it pretty regularly, I take it.
I have to, yes.
Has to.
In fact, I'm very annoyed at the moment because this is, my wife is not so obsessed, and so they've all stopped. She rang me this morning and said, the house is eerily silent.
And you said, there's a reason.
There's a reason for that, sweetheart, yes.
Well, thank you so much. So we give our thanks to Simon Winchester, journalist and author of the new book, which I very highly recommend, The Perfectionists, How Precision Engineers Created the Modern World. We also thank everyone here, as well as our audience on radio, television, and the internet. This program has been held in association with the Mechanics Institute, and we want to remind everyone that Simon will sign books right out there, outside this room immediately following this program. I'm Katie Hafner, and now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club, the place where you are in the know, is adjourned.